أهلا وسهلا بكم إلى هذا اللقاء الخاص الذي نحاور فيه أحد أبرز الشخصيات الإعلامية الأمريكية، صاحب الخبرة الواسعة في السياسة الذي لم يغب عنه الفن. تنقل من الإذاعة إلى التلفاز وأجرى عشرات المقابلات والحوارات مع نخبة من أشهر الشخصيات العامة بمن فيهم الرئيس الأمريكي دونالد ترامب وأكثر من 20 رئيس دولة حول العالم، ليصبح سيد المقابلات الفذة. السيد تيم كونستانتين، أهلا وسهلا بك في إربيل عاصمة كردستان، وتحديدا في بيتك قناة الشمس.
Thanks very much. Appreciate the chance to be here.
اليوم أنت الضيف لكنك اعتدت أن تكون المحاور، أيهما يستهويك أكثر؟
You know, it's funny, I've done both. When I was a young man, I served 8 years in politics. I served in elected office for 8 years, so I was the guest most of the time then. But even before that, when I was 13 years old, I started working in radio and then have worked in broadcasting most of my life. So I enjoy both sides. I appreciate the chance to talk with you.
سأبدأ معك من الأخير. بداية، أنت تمتلك كل هذه الخبرة في السياسة الأمريكية، ماذا يعني لك أن تكون جزءاً من شبكة إعلام كردستان عبر منصة بولس؟
You know what I like is the beginning, the hope. I was just talking with someone earlier today and I said, I enjoy, even if it's in my local hometown, if someone opens a new beauty parlor, someone opens a new small grocery store, I don't even have to know them, and I'm excited because a new venture usually equals hope. People have hope for a good business, they have hope to serve their community, they have hope, in this case, to spread good news, to spread the word to people all over the Arab community. So I see this as a great opportunity to be part of something really special, but that word hope is what stands out to me.
ولكن انطلاقا من خبرتك في الإعلام، ما هي أهمية أن يكون للكرد قناة تتحدث باللغة العربية تتوجه للعالم العربي كشمس، وأخرى تتوجه للمجتمع الأمريكي كمنصة بولس؟
I think the ability to reach both in both languages is important, but understanding culture is important too. And I think that cross that's being done here between the American platform and the Kurd platform allows some understanding of both cultures. The cultures are different, and yet human nature everywhere is very much the same. We all want the best for our children. We all want a better life. So finding the things in common, I think this platform in both areas provides an opportunity to find the things in common and to respect those areas in which we're different.
نعم، وبالعودة إلى إقليم كردستان وبالحديث عن كردستان، كيف وجدت استقبال أهالي كردستان لك وما أبرز ما لفتك في أربيل؟
I just landed in Erbil last night, so I haven't seen as much, and I'll be here for a few days, so I'm looking forward to this visit. But what jumps out at me is there are parts of the Middle East region that are beautiful, there are parts that are challenged, and then there are parts that are somewhere in between that are trying to develop. And what I see here is great. It's clearly the process of planning. You know, it doesn't get as good as it is and as organized as it is unless careful planning went into that. And I can see where things are going down the road as well. So I think first impression is very good.
نعم، وهذا جيد، وأهلا بك من جديد هنا في إقليم كردستان. وسأتحدث قليلا عن السياسة كونك خبير في الشأن الأمريكي، كيف ينظر الأمريكيون إلى القضية الكردية؟
I think, truthfully, the American public doesn't know as much as they could, and I think that's an opportunity for Pulse to make sure that, I always say that's a good thing. When America isn't sure yet, doesn't have a full impression yet, there's an opportunity to shape their opinion, to shape. So I think there's an opportunity for Pulse really to help give an accurate view and shape the public perception in the United States. I think from a political standpoint, from Washington's standpoint, there's a pretty good understanding that there is stability here, and that's not true in many parts of the region. So when there are places that are the light, so to speak, there are places where you know that you can count on, and I think there's just a wonderful relationship between the American administration and Kurdistan. So I think there's an opportunity to enhance that, but I think the government relationships are very good. I think on the public end, there's some learning to be done, but that's not necessarily a bad thing.
نعم، وبالحديث عن هذا الموضوع يعني للبلدين علاقة تاريخية، وهناك يعني دور تاريخي أمريكي في إقليم كردستان. كيف تصف اليوم العلاقة بين البلدين، بين الولايات المتحدة وبين كردستان؟
I think, if we go back then, and George W. Bush and the relationship there was outstanding. You go through the different presidents in the different years, but I think there's two things. Donald Trump is sometimes seen because he is so brash. He will say things sometimes that are less diplomatic. People don't understand that he is very much in favor of A, peace, but B, economic prosperity, not just for the United States, but for the world. He knows that that brings stability, and that stability feeds peace, and it's one big circle. You can maintain peace if you've got a strong economy and the people are happy and so on. So I think the Trump administration sees Kurdistan as a beacon of hope for the area, certainly a stable place in the area, and I'd go so far as probably to say an example for much of the area as to what can be done and a path that can continue from here.
كيف ترى مستقبل إقليم كردستان والعلاقة بين الولايات المتحدة وكردستان في ظل التطورات الراهنة وفي ولاية ترامب الحالية؟ كما ذكرت يعني ترامب لديه طباع لا تشبه طباع الرؤساء الأمريكيين السابقين.
The approach, though, is what I would call pragmatic. And I think if you look at the immediate, I don't want to be too critical, but you look at the immediate past administration, President Biden, who had very few friends in the Arab community, also did not get along at all with Netanyahu or the Jewish community. He essentially had no friends in the entire region. And so that puts America in a very awkward position when you have a president that doesn't understand the region and doesn't appear to have any desire to enhance those relationships. I think Donald Trump clearly does. What we saw in his first administration were the Abraham Accords. He was trying to normalize relations between Arab countries and the Jews, and some of that, there were certain places where they objected, they weren't sure that was, but anytime you get people working together and cooperating in general, that's a good thing. So I understand you can be mad at someone or you can be frustrated with how they operate certain ways, but usually if you have a cooperative relationship, business or otherwise, in the long term that benefits. I think Kurdistan has a great understanding of that, has a clear understanding of having long-term planning, having goals, and you meet those goals as you go along the way, of working with neighbors to make sure that you are doing the best, whether that's Iran, whether it's a strange situation in Syria, nobody's quite sure how that's going to unfold, and yet the way it's being handled here is very diplomatic. So I think this is a great example. And then when you go to Washington, perhaps the most important role in all of that, as far as the Kurdistan-U.S. relationship, is the United States has to have some friends, some allies that President Trump can pick up the telephone and talk to and feel confident that the information he's going to get is accurate and helpful, and I think he feels like he can do that here. So when the question being, what's the future hold in the region with this administration and beyond, who knows what the next, who will be president 10 years from now, but for this president, I think he understands the region, the challenges, the importance, and he understands economic development, and all of those work well, within the region.
نعم، سأتطرق إلى فكرة أخيرة في هذا السياق قبل أن أنتقل إلى المحور الثاني. هناك تقارير تتحدث عن نقل القوات الأمريكية من سوريا وأيضا من العراق واتجاههم نحو أربيل أو كردستان. كيف نقرأ ذلك برأيك؟
I try not to operate in the rumor business. I don't have any factual information on that, and I think maintaining a presence in the vicinity is, as long as it's not overwhelming. I think if we're wanted, if the United States is wanted in other places, we don't want to go anywhere we're not wanted. But If the United States' presence is desired and helps add to stability in small numbers, then that's a good thing. And I think, again, your question being specific to Kurdistan, it would not surprise me simply because of the good relationship, the strong relationship between the United States and the leadership here.
نعم، اسمح لي أن أبتعد قليلا عن هذا المحور السياسي وأنتقل إلى تجربتك الشخصية وتجربتك المهنية. يعني التقيت بالعديد من قادة الدول، أقمت العديد من الحوارات. ما يمكن للمشاهد أن يراه هو مختلف عما يمكن للمحاور أن يراه. ما هو الحوار أو ما هي المقابلة التي أثرت بك بشكل غير متوقع؟
Boy, I don't know. That's a good question. There are some that you enjoy more than others. There are some where, particularly with world leaders, you often know what they will say before you ask the question because they tend to have a script they stick to. So when you meet a leader who is more candid or who is more personal in their answer as opposed to very scripted, I always enjoy those. I've interviewed President Trump 4 times, and he is a character because you never know what he will say. He sometimes will say things that you had no idea were coming. And so it's a more enjoyable interview, a more stimulating interview because you don't know where it's going. And so those are great. But I like in various parts of the world, and that may, I'll give you a couple examples. We'll sit down with the president of Uganda. It's a very, very different interview than if I sit down with someone here in the region. Here it tends to be a little more formal, and so it's, you get a little different product, but I think you learn a lot about the culture wherever you are as well, not simply by the conversation, but by how the interview itself is handled. When they bring you in, how they handle that, how friendly it is, how there are some places where it's actually adversarial from the beginning, which is odd to me that if you and I are going to have a conversation, why would I want to be adversarial with you? But there are some places where they anticipate that or they even promote that a little bit where they're adversarial and they're upset before it even starts. And I try to bring that back and I'd rather just have a conversation with someone. And it doesn't have to be a stiff, script that I just want to talk to somebody and find out what they think about different issues. And one of my peeves in the United States is U.S. journalists often interrupt, and they often will project their own narrative into the story. They will be talking to a prime minister or a president, and they interrupt them and say, "Yes, but don't you think you should?" And I think that's terrible. I want to know what the prime minister thinks. I don't need to tell the world over and over what I think. I just want to ask the question and then let them answer. And so I think that's the most important part to come out is let each world leader has their own personality. We're all people, but let them be themselves, and then I think we learn a lot more.
نعم، يعني هناك أسئلة كثيرة تلي الإجابة التي قلتها. بداية إذا تحدثنا عن المحاور، كيف للمحاور أن يكون حيادي وموضوعي وألا يدخل رأيه الشخصي في قضية تهمه وتخصه برأيك؟
I would hope that they are. It doesn't, truthfully, it doesn't matter if they're impacted by it. If the purpose of the interview is to get information, I want to get information as much as I can. If I have 20 minutes with the president of a country, I want as close to 20 minutes of information from him or her. I don't care what the reporter thinks. I don't care what I think. I want to know what that, because I'm not going to have any more time with them. I can hear from the reporter another time. You can hear from me another time. But you have a very tiny window to get insight from someone who actually impacts the story. So if I'm sitting down with Netanyahu talking about Gaza, I don't need to, Netanyahu's not going to change his opinion because I tell him something. So I need to know, I just want to know what he thinks and get as much information as I can from him. Even if I don't like it, I want to get as much information as I can from him. I don't want to argue with him. I don't want to tell him my opinion. So I think even if a reporter is impacted by it, it is absolutely essential that the world not know what I think on that issue, just hear from that person.
سيد تم، وذكرت أيضا خلال الإجابة السابقة أن المحاور نظرته تختلف عن نظرة المشاهد أو القارئ، فهو يرى عن كثب الأمور. كيف تتغير نظرة المحاور للأمور أو بشأن قضية معينة حين يقوم بمقابلة معينة، وهل اختبرت ذلك؟
It's not the job of the interviewer, if you mean to change the guest's point of view or to change their own point of view.
يعني كيف تتغير نظرة المحاور الخاصة تجاه أي قضية معينة بعد أن يحاور ويرى الموضوع عن كثب؟
Sure, I think the answer to that is then let the person tell you why. Don't try to convince that person what you think. Don't argue with the person. Again, that's not my job. If I want to do that off air, off camera, and when you meet with some of these folks, you often spend 15 minutes with them before you ever sit down on camera. And I may talk to them then and ask them or debate with them or share my ideas with them, but when we're sitting down, that's really not my job to convince them or to have them convince me. My job is to find out what they think and let the world know what they think. Why does Benjamin Netanyahu do what he does? Why do the leaders of Hamas do what they do? Why, whomever the guest is, what I think really doesn't matter. And I could really like someone, I could really dislike someone. You shouldn't even be able to tell the difference. I just want you to hear from my guest. And I think we lose a lot because on television you will see, you host a show. You will host tomorrow. You will host next week. You will host next month. And so people have an opportunity to see and be influenced by you repeatedly. But you may only sit down with President Trump once. So you need to maximize that time with Trump. And when you want to share your own opinion, you have another opportunity to do that. You have another venue to do that. But I think anytime you have those high-profile guests, it's not my place to argue with them. It's I want to pull as much accurate information as I can get. And the one thing I will try to do is go beyond their standard answers. They will have their answers that they give everyone. And the mark of a good interviewer, in my opinion, is if you can get them to say more than they normally say. Share more. How did they get to that point? Why do they think that? Is it because when they were 8 years old something traumatic happened, or is it because they had a bad day yesterday? There's a lot of reasons why people decide to do what they do, and I think sometimes understanding why Benjamin Netanyahu does what he does is just as important as what he does. If you can understand why, then maybe you can influence changing it.
سيد تم، سنكمل حوارنا ولكن نتوقف الآن مع فاصل قصير ونعود إلى هذا الحوار. أهلا بكم من جديد. سنتحدث قليلا عن حياتك الخاصة. بدأت مسيرتك الإعلامية في سن 13 وعملت في مجالي الروك والبوب خلال دراستك الجامعية. ألا تعتقد أنك طرقت باب الشهرة في عمر صغير، وكيف صقل ذلك شخصيتك؟
I think fame would probably be generous term there, but I enjoyed it. I did enjoy radio very much. I do television, I write for a newspaper, and yet radio is still my favorite medium because I've done it. My voice changed very early. I had this voice when I was 13, so I started doing radio, and it was mostly for fun, and then I could pay the bills through college doing it, but and then later it did help a great deal in public speaking. I mentioned that I served 8 years in public office, and so I would give 120 or 130 speeches a year, and because you had worked in broadcasting, then speaking was very easy.
حدثني قليلا عن تجربتك مع 2 Tickets with كونستانتين وعن رحلة الصعود من حيث المميزات ومن حيث السلبيات.
It was really fun. I was actually, while I was in political office, I started the television show because I missed broadcasting, and I just did that as a sideline. And it was on once a week, but it was mostly either rock and roll or sports stars. So I would sit down with Mike Tyson or Buster Douglas, big boxing or big tennis people, Bjorn Borg, or big tennis people. But I sat down mostly with musicians, and so it would be a lot of the music that had been popular from, that show was on in the 90s. So it was musicians that had been popular from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And we would do interviews, but they would also play. And so they would come and usually just bring an acoustic guitar or something. They wouldn't bring the whole band. And it was amazing to see this music that you'd been listening to for 10 years or 15 years pouring out of the human being that was sitting right beside you and sounding perfect. You know, it was a wonderful experience to really appreciate the gift that they had.
نعم، إذن أنت اختبرت الفن واختبرت السياسة. أخبرني أين يلتقي الفن مع السياسة وأين يختلف الفن مع السياسة؟
I think, you know, the responsibilities are similar in that you would hope that both give accurate information. You would hope that both give their effort for the best interest of people, and yet that's not necessarily the case. So in politics, we often accuse politicians of doing stuff for themselves or for their friends, and there are some wonderful people in politics, but there are also occasionally some bad people in politics, and sadly they get the attention sometimes more than the good people. But in the entertainment world, I'm worried a little bit in that, you know, earlier we talked about whether or not I should be arguing with my guests and so on, and there's a place for that. But if you are really a news reporter, not an opinion person, but a news reporter, then I think your responsibility is to get news out. I think a lot of news people now think they are the story, and they want their brand, their name out there, and so they try to be shocking, or they will tell a narrative that may or may not be accurate. And we've seen it on all levels. I mean, Brian Williams on NBC was literally the most watched news person in the world, and it turned out he had been embellishing stories, making stories up. And so, you know, and as soon as that was discovered, his popularity dropped. And I think the responsibility of journalists is not a whole lot different than the responsibility of public officials, in that both have to tell the whole story. They've got to be honest and straightforward, but it can't just be your side of the story. You have to, the narrative has to be complete. And that's my biggest worry is right now, I think a lot of media tends to decide before they do their report, this is what we're going to tell. They haven't even researched it yet, but this is what they're going to tell. And then when they go research, they only research that side of the story instead of the whole story. And I think that's doing the public a disservice.
نعم، ولكن هنا في هذه النقطة سيد تيم، يعني عالمنا يتغير وأيضا يتغير معه الإعلام. كيف يمكن للإعلامي وللصحفي أن يحافظ على مهنيته وبنفس الوقت أن يكتسب المزيد من المشاهدات؟
I think you have to decide, do you want the world to hear your opinion, or do you want to report news? Because those aren't the same thing. In the olden days, when I was a boy, when there were newspapers, there was news and there were editorial pages. And the editorial pages is where the opinions were. And I think the same has to be true on television, in radio, on podcasts, in the digital world. You have to clearly delineate, is this hard news or is this an opinion? It doesn't get delineated now. AP, Associated Press, is the largest news agency in the world. And you will see writing by the Associated Press that inserts the writer's opinion into the story over and over and over. And then that gets repeated in venues literally all around the globe. And so I think that's unfortunate. I think you need to assume the public is intelligent enough that if you tell them the full story, they can decide for themselves. I think it's an insult to the public for me to decide, I know better than everyone else. I will filter what you're going to hear, and you're only going to hear what I want you to hear. I think that's a terrible disservice. So to answer very specifically, to answer your question, is, you know, it is a different world. The digital world has made things very different, and it allows people to broadcast or podcast directly. But I still think that responsibility exists. And if you want to be taken seriously, then you have to decide. Do you want to tell news and let people be informed completely, or do you want to share your opinion with the world? Because they're very different. At the Washington Times, which I write for, the president of the Washington Times has said, if you're an opinion writer, You can do whatever you want. You want to have a Twitter account, an X account, you want to have Instagram, go ahead. But if you are the White House correspondent, or you are the Capitol Hill correspondent, or any of the other hard news, the president has said, I don't want to see I don't want you to have a Twitter account that tells what you think. I don't care what you think. Your readers don't care what you think. They only want to know what's actually happening at the White House. They only want to know what's actually happening on Capitol Hill. And so he has put out the decree that those who write hard news, their opinion doesn't appear anywhere, because that's not what they do. And I think that's a great way to do it. I think a television station can have both. I think a newspaper can have both. But I think as an individual, you can't do both. You've got to decide, am I a hard news reporter or am I opinion purveyor? Because they're very different.
هنا في هذه النقطة بالتحديد سيد تيم، برأيك ما هي العناصر التي تصنع توك شو ناجحا في وقت يتراجع فيه التلفاز وأهمية التلفاز تتراجع على حساب مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي؟
The most successful news talk host in the United States was a guy named Tim Russert. And Mr. Russert died about 10 years ago, quite suddenly. He was young. I think he was 57 or 59. He was very young to die. But everyone said when he passed, oh, he was the best. He was so good. And yet no one emulates him. No one tries to do what he did. And what he would do was, before every interview, he would prepare, and he would sometimes know more about his topic than his guest, even though they were an expert. But you had no idea what Tim Russert's opinion was. He would ask questions, and he could be firm, and if they weren't answering questions, he could really push them because he was so well informed. But he could still be polite, he could still be courteous. You had no idea what his personal opinion was, and he drew the most out of his guests, because if they went on, they knew they would be challenged. They knew that he was going to be well informed, but they also knew he would be fair. And what you've seen, if you go in the United States, for example, there is Fox News, which tends to like the Republican Party, the Donald Trumps of the world. You have MSNBC and CNN, which hates Donald Trump, and they will support the other party. But they go so far as to alter the content in favor of whichever they like and not tell the whole story. So the result is Americans in general don't trust the media at all. In a Gallup poll last year, the media had about 29% of the people said they trust them. That means almost 3/4 of the people don't trust them. So you're not doing your job if people don't believe you.
إذن هنا يمكن القول أن الإعلام في ورطة، والإعلام في تراجع عالمي كما ذكرت، يعني كما تحدثنا عن الإعلام الأمريكي، ولكن يبقى هناك بعض الأشخاص أو بعض وسائل الإعلام التي تبني مصداقية وعلاقة خاصة مع المشاهد ومع الجمهور. سأعود إلى تجربتك الشخصية، هل اصطحبت معك جمهورك من الإذاعة إلى التلفزيون أولا؟ وكيف يمكن لأي شو، لأي برنامج أن يخلق هذه المصداقية والعلاقة الخاصة مع جمهوره ومع مشاهديه؟
I think you have to be consistent. It's no different than nation building. You have to be consistent, and you have to build an audience, and they have to know you and know that you will be honest and straightforward with them. And sometimes they will not like that. Sometimes they will not like your guest, but they're going to hear from that guest. And I did both radio and TV simultaneously, and truthfully, I've let radio go only because I've run out of time. I write for a paper, I do some other things for the Washington Times, and I do a lot of television, and so I didn't have 3 hours a day to do radio anymore. But I think on both of those platforms, I'll tell you the thing I miss most about radio is it's more personal, meaning people felt like, my perception was, people felt like they knew me. Like they would have me on, radio is often people are in their car, and so they would have me on when they were driving home from work, or they would have me on as they were preparing dinner in the evening, and so I was part of their daily routine every day with radio. And it wasn't, because you're in their home and there's no visual associated, they're not looking at a studio, they're just hearing your voice, but they're in their own kitchen, or they're in their own car, or they're in their own office. You're with them wherever they are. and you're a part of them wherever they are. So that was the magic of radio, was people felt connected. I would meet people on the street, or you would have people call the show who had been listening for years, and they honestly felt like they were great friends with you because you had been part of their life every day for years. And so that was, I think radio was great that way, but I think you can take that same lesson and you can build that personal relationship on television. You know, it's a little different because they're stationary. Whether they're watching you on a digital platform or watching you on the big screen in their living room, everything they watch is there. You know, everything they, so it's not the same as radio when you're in their kitchen or you're in their car, but it's still, I think you can build that personal relationship where if they trust you, they trust what you're saying, they trust who you are, that they're at least going to listen to your guests. They may dislike Donald Trump, but they'll listen to him if I'm talking to him. They know that I'm going to get a real answer out of him.
سيد تيم، سنكمل هذا الحوار وفي هذا السياق، لكن بعد هذا الفاصل ابقوا معنا. أهلا بكم من جديد في هذا الحوار الخاص مع ضيفي تيم كونستانتين، وسأبدأ معك سيد تيم من حيث انتهينا قبل الفاصل. كنت تتحدث عن التفاعل، ما أهمية اليوم بين التفاعل بين المذيع أو المقدم والجمهور، وكيف تصل البرامج إلى هذه المرحلة من التفاعل؟
I think the most important thing is that the host is themselves. That sounds really simple, but if you watch television, a lot of people are trying to be something. They're not just being themselves. They're trying to be forceful. They're trying to be funny. They're trying. If you're naturally funny, great. If you're naturally aggressive, great. But just be yourself. And I think that authenticity comes through. And I think you connect with the viewer. And I think then they feel like they know you. And I think that's true in everything in life. That's not just true in television. If you're a doctor and you can communicate with people and they're ill and they talk to you and feel like you can relate to them, they're going to do a better job at understanding what their medical need is because you're just talking with them. And so I think in all walks of life, just being your authentic self, being comfortable with yourself is really important. But I think that comes across more on television than anywhere else. And so because they're seeing you, they're feeling you, they're hearing what you're saying. In some formats, you're looking directly at the camera, so you're looking directly at the person watching. And so you have to be able to get along, you know, and be comfortable. I think if it's anything less than authentic, people can tell that. And I think that's true in politics, maybe as a great example, is Hillary Clinton ran for president of the United States. Hillary Clinton had been in the public eye when she ran for 30 years, but she was still doing polling a year before she ran for president to help her decide what she thought on things, what would be popular. People always ask me, you know, for years after she lost, why did she lose? Everyone knew her, the media loved her. Well, why did she lose? Because she wasn't her authentic self. She was trying to find what other people wanted to hear. To this day, I have no idea what Hillary Clinton really thinks because she's always trying to figure out, calculate what people want. And so I mean, politics is true, in any walk of life it's true, but maybe more than anywhere on television that's true, that if you just meet, you know, be yourself, meet people where you're at, that comes across.
وهنا في هذه النقطة ربما ما يميز مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي عن التلفاز هو أن في مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي هناك هذا التفاعل، الانتراكشن الذي كنت تتحدث عنه. إلى أي مدى ترى اليوم أن الشركات التي تملك هذه المواقع كميتا وكجوجل تمتلك تأثيرا سياسيا ويمكنها أن توجه الرأي العام؟
I think the social media companies have a huge influence, and what we saw them doing, and it's changed some, but it could change back at any time. What we saw them doing was filtering information. Now, you and I have seen governments do that around the world, where governments may tell certain broadcast networks or others or that they can't do things. Or if I travel to China, you know, they're still playing Michael Jackson music as new music. Oh, it's the new song from Michael Jackson. He's been dead for 20 years, but it's new to them because China does not allow certain content to get out. And so I saw Facebook, I saw Google, I saw others filtering what would and wouldn't get out. And they would decide that certain things, I don't mean, pornography, I don't mean death, I don't mean evil things, I mean political views. These are corporations, these aren't political bodies. No one has elected Google, no one has chosen Facebook to help me decide what I should think, but they took it upon themselves to filter certain political views, and I think that's a dangerous road. And again, the theme that you and I have talked about the whole time here is, I want to present a full picture to people, and I trust most people are going to be reasonable and rational and make their decision based on good information. And sometimes people will agree with what I think, and sometimes they won't, but I think most people are bright enough to make their own choice.
عندما تتحكم الخوارزميات لمواقع التواصل الاجتماعي بما يمكن لأي مستخدم أن يراه وأن لا يراه، كيف يؤثر ذلك على المجتمع وعلى السياسات العالمية؟ تحدثت عن خطورة لهذا الموضوع، ما هي خطورته وكيف ممكن أن يوجه السياسات العالمية أيضا؟
It's a huge danger, and it can completely change world politics. Now, I'll give you an American example because it's what I'm most familiar with, but we could pick examples like this all over the globe. When Joe Biden was running against Donald Trump in 2020, his son, Hunter Biden, had a laptop, and it had all kinds of inappropriate things on it, but it had information on it. It had some things that appeared to make him guilty of association with certain countries. And at the time, the American media, and particularly the digital media, decided that wasn't a story. And so they simply did not cover it. They were afraid that that would impact the election if Hunter Biden, and then by association Joe Biden, were seen as corrupt, that it would impact the election. So they simply didn't tell the story. And I talked to some of my friends at CNN on broadcast side or on the digital side, to people at Google, and said, what if that had been Donald Trump Jr.? If every other fact was the same, except the person was Donald Trump instead of Hunter Biden. And they literally said to me, well, that would be different. And I said, it's not any different. You don't, either it's news that a presidential candidate's son is corrupt, or it's not news. But it shouldn't matter which candidate it is to make it news. So I do think that impacted the election. After the fact, like a year later, they polled Americans when it turned out it was all true about Hunter Biden, and they polled Americans who had voted for Joe Biden and said, would that have changed your vote had you known that? And it was like 20% of the people that voted for Joe Biden said, yeah, it would have changed my vote. So the direction of the world, you can believe or not believe, but if you believe Donald Trump says Ukraine never would have happened if he were president, that might be true, simply because Vladimir Putin thinks Donald Trump is crazy and that he may have reacted. Would Gaza have happened if Donald Trump were president? I don't know. I'm not saying yes or no, but it's a fair question to ask. So did Google and CNN and the others change the direction of the world by changing content that had an impact on the election? I think it's easy to say, yeah, how it changed. I'm not suggesting what would have been different. I am saying things would have been different. And so that's one example, but does it happen every day? Does it happen on smaller things? Does it happen on a mayoral level in some city somewhere? Probably. Does it happen with commerce, with automobiles or other things? Probably, and so you and I earlier talked in terms of great responsibility if you're in politics, great responsibility if you're in media, if you're a journalist, but it may be an even greater responsibility if you're working on the data side, if you are the Googles of the world and the whole world of information filters through you, you really have more responsibility than anyone. You have a responsibility to the public.
إلى أي مدى تعتقد أن هناك خطة ممنهجة ويتم التلاعب بخوارزميات مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي، بالمعنى أنه في هذا المجتمع نرى منشورات معينة، وفي المجتمع الآخر نرى منشورات أخرى. كل هذا إلى أي مدى ترى أنه ممنهج ومخطط؟ وما رأيك بالاتهامات الموجهة لفيسبوك مثلا بتدخله بالانتخابات الأمريكية مثلا؟
Yeah, I think there's very clearly has been planning. I think you saw when Trump was reelected this time, immediately Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, the head of Facebook, came forward and said, well, we're going to change our algorithm now. We're going to do it differently. And which is an admission that we were doing something. We had intentionally done something before, and we're going to change that now because we see the world differently now. And in my opinion, what he sees differently is a president whose approval he needs for certain business things is not the guy that he was supporting 4 years before. So now he's going to do something that maybe favors. And I'm disgusted by that when you see people change in personal friendships. You see their personality change because they're trying to kiss up to their boss, or they're trying to make an impression on someone. The idea that the CEO of one of the largest purveyors of information on planet Earth has no backbone and is going to change depending on whatever direction the wind is blowing politically that day is disgraceful. So I'm glad that Facebook came forward and says, all right, we're not going to filter, but I'm disgusted that they spent the better part of 8 years filtering information, and now admit that they did that, but filtering information that you and I should have rightfully seen.
هنا ما رأيك بسياسة إيلون ماسك بخصوص منصة إكس في هذا السياق؟
I think Musk opened up many things, and what's funny is anything that now that is questioned or asked on there, then particularly the left-wing media will scream, oh, he's censoring things. But the previous owners of X, Jack was running things on a day-to-day basis, and he would actually personally make phone calls and tell them this wasn't like an algorithm. This was the head of the company would see something he didn't like, and he'd call and tell his tech team to take it down. And that's clear. You couldn't have any clearer interference than, and this isn't an algorithm that mistakenly picked something. This is their CEO picking and choosing what can go. So I think by and large what Musk has done is open the platform. I think they have to be careful. There's certain content you don't want to appear for children, for other reasons. But I think by and large, if we're talking in terms of information, then I think we're in better shape than we were 4 years ago. I thought it was funny that people were cheering against him when he first bought it, and they cut about 80% of the workforce to start, and there were people hoping that X would collapse and X would fail. And even when I don't care for someone, I don't hope for failure. I don't hope for death. I never understand that approach. I would love to persuade people that don't agree with me, but I don't hope for their failure in life or misery in life. So I never understand that approach. And so I'm glad to see that, they tilted a little in the months following his purchase, but then they righted the ship, and it seems to be running well now. And there's certainly other things they need to do as they move forward. There always will be. But in general, I think he's doing a much better job than was done as far as all information being available.
ما الذي برأيك يمكن أن تفعله الحكومات لكي تحد من تأثير مواقع التواصل الاجتماعي على الآراء العامة لكي تحمي الحرية بالتعبير؟
It's always a question as to how you have a free media but still hold them accountable. That's not new. It's new in its format. But 100 years ago, they used to talk in terms when the newspaper was the primary, a daily newspaper in every city was the primary purveyor of information. They used to talk about you can't argue with someone who buys ink by the barrel, meaning, this guy sends a note out to everybody every day. It's hard to argue with him. It's a much bigger barrel now. In the digital platform, you can go worldwide. So it's the same old question there's a responsibility that goes with that. How do you make sure you don't tell them what they can and can't say, which I don't believe is the government's job. I mean, you can put certain, you can't show violent things or, but as far as political opinion, it shouldn't be up to government what's okay and what's not. And there was actually a movement, there was a short-lived attempt by the Biden administration to establish an office that would determine what content was and was not appropriate, meaning political content, what was and wasn't accurate, what was and wasn't. And the idea in the United States that the government was going to tell us that was outrageous. The public exploded, saying this is a crazy idea, and it didn't last very long. I think the woman they appointed to head that office lasted about 6 weeks, and then they closed the office back down again and realized that wasn't going to work. But so as a society, as a culture, no one in the West wants to hear the government telling media what they can and can't do, but you do have to put some guide rails so that at least they are honest or straightforward. They can't withhold information. They can't tell you false information. And I think where the challenge has been, when it was in print or when it was in broadcast, then the law in the United States and much of the West was you were okay as long as you were telling the truth. But you could be sued for libel, for slander, if you were telling untruths. And what you found was because there was that limit, because there was that responsibility, then very rarely did they tell untruths. But in the digital age, where they're trying to get clicks and they're trying to get attention, and it might be you or me in the basement of our home with a podcast instead of, you know, a large conglomerate, nobody's sure where some of this information is coming from. It's become much more difficult to hold whomever the source is accountable. And that's the challenge they face right now, is how do we do that? How do you, if someone is a small one-person entity, but they're influencing thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people, how do we hold them accountable? And I think they're starting to get a grip on that, but that's really the challenge. It's an age-old question, it's just a new format.
سيتم كما ذكرت الإعلامي يخضع لعدة ضغوطات بخاصة تلك المتعلقة بالمحتوى. حدثني قليلا عن دور جماعات الضغط في التأثير على أداء الإعلام خلال المحطات المهمة.
Yeah, it's interesting to see the way people try to influence the media. We think of lobbyists as trying to influence politics, but most people understand that if they influence the media, they influence the public. They influence what the perception of the public is. So we certainly see people trying to do that. And sometimes the media is complicit in this. During Barack Obama's presidential administration, in general, the American media loved Barack Obama to an unhealthy extent. And so the Obama administration, or people that worked in industries that were associated, private industry, but that were associated with goals of the Obama administration, would send out media releases. And if people saw it was affiliated, much of the media, if they saw it was affiliated with the Obama administration, they would go to television or they would go to print word for word. They would do no research of their own whatsoever. They would simply print whatever the Obama administration had sent them. And you could watch local broadcast in Colorado or a regional broadcast out of the South or a national broadcast, and they would all be saying the exact same words, which is unheard of course. And you realize at some point, oh, they're just reading Obama's lines. And again, there are some parts of the country where, some parts of the world where I go and that's normal. The government tells them what to say. That is not normal in the United States of America. And media tends to be very independent and want to be able to say and do their own thing. So when they all kind of fell in lockstep, that was kind of scary to watch them all publishing the pro-Obama stuff word for word. And so I think now in the digital format, the tough part is just trying to sort out, you know, what's what and who's who. But where did that information come from? To your point, you know, people are trying to lobby media, people trying to influence what goes on in the world, and that may be in what clothes you're wearing, that may be in you know, what watch you have on while you're on. None of that's new, but the idea that the content of what's being said is being influenced, sometimes purchased, that's a scary prospect.
تحدثنا عن علاقة ولاية الرئيس السابق باراك أوباما بالإعلام، ولكن اليوم الرئيس الأمريكي الحالي دونالد ترامب يوقف التمويل لبعض المؤسسات الإعلامية. كيف تصف علاقة ترامب بالإعلام الأمريكي اليوم؟
He's not, the only thing he's talked about stopping is the United States government puts some funding into National Public Radio, NPR, or there's a televised version of that, public television, which when they were created, I'm a lot older than you, so when I was a little boy, there were 3 channels. There was CBS, there was NBC, and there was ABC. That was it. You didn't turn your TV on with 75 channels on there. There were 3 channels. ABC was brand new at the time. So up until then, there'd only been 2 channels. So having a public broadcast network that provided information that was more solid news, or they had great children's programming, Sesame Street originated on public broadcasting. Those were all, it made perfect sense. There was no other outlet where that came from. Now, with hundreds of channels to choose from and thousands of digital platforms to choose from, there really isn't a need for public to be paying for a network on television or on radio. And there is pretty strong evidence that both of them, their leadership, both of those organizations' leadership, tended to take political views one way or the other, which was never their original intent or goal and not their history. So I think their time has expired. I think their usefulness has passed. I don't think broadcast is the future. I think digital is the future, but I also don't think in the broadcast realm that you need to be one of 100 or 200 stations. So what the president is doing there and taking that money away is no different than him cutting money from all kinds of places that government seems to be throwing it away right now. And truthfully, I would rather keep more of my own money instead of give the government more money. So I'm happy. I hope he keeps cutting.
سيد كونستانتين، شكرا جزيلا لك على هذا الحوار وهذه الحلقة الخاصة. مشاهدينا، هنا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة الخاصة مع تيم كونستانتين الإعلامي تيم كونستانتين. وفي الختام أشكرك على هذا الحوار طبعا الغني، وأودعك كضيف اليوم، ولكنك باق معنا في أسرة قناة شمس عبر برنامجك الشهير The Capitol Hill Show. شكرا جزيلا لك وإلى اللقاء. إلى اللقاء.